Okay, how's it going, everyone? So I'm taking a little break from the Christmas horror right now just to do something I've kind of wanted to do for a little while, and that's sort of go through some of the filmmakers that are important to me for various reasons and just talk about their filmography very briefly and rank it. And today, admittedly, I didn't work too hard for this one, but I decided I'd start off by just ranking Tarantino's films quickly because, first of all, he's only got 9 of them to date so far, 9 directorial efforts anyway, so that makes it a lot easier. He's not a filmmaker that really needs any introduction. If you, by some weird chance, are unfamiliar with Tarantino, there are plenty of YouTube videos and articles online at this point to tell you all about him without getting any extra help from me. So again, yeah, I'm not going to bother. I think I'll just get right into it. I'm going to assume that you know all about Tarantino and you're just kind of curious as to what my take on this is going to be. Couple little things I'm going to mention at the outset here. First of all, I'm not including screenplays. This is just directorial efforts. So unfortunately, as much as I love True Romance, that one's not going to be popping up here, nor is Natural Born Killers or Four Rooms, or even Sin City for that matter, despite the fact that he guest directed one of my favorite scenes in that movie. Rules are rules. He is not hair director on that one, so we're going to leave that out too. And the other thing I think I should mention, just as a little bit more of a broad warning here, is that even though Tarantino is certainly one of my favorite filmmakers, besides the fact that he is not my absolute favorite, I'm not the kind of person who will just always blindly worship someone, even if I'm a big fan of theirs. Believe it or not, it is in fact possible to be a fan of a filmmaker, an author, a musician, or something like that, and not absolutely love and lap up every single goddamn thing they do. I think a lot of people kind of forget that. So if you clicked on this hoping that you would hear 10 or 20 minutes of nothing but me riding Tarantino's sausage, spoiler alert, that's not happening. So without further ado, we'll just get started here, and of course we're kicking it off with 1992's Reservoir Dogs. Let me tell you, ranking this filmography was extremely hard. Like, it's not even so much a question of any movies that I dislike as movies that I like just a little bit more for weird little personal reasons. But in any case, this one sits comfortably at number 2. This is my favorite 90s era Tarantino film. I'm well aware that it has a lot of the traits of a first-time filmmaker if you know where to look for it, but he never ever again packed as much raw panache, energy, swagger, and just full throttle love for film as he did into this movie. Everything about this movie, from the opening circling camera conversation in the diner to Michael Madsen's big scene torturing the cop, to the way that scene ends with Mr. Orange waking up and shooting him, to the climax, to everything, the whole damn movie. This thing is just utterly classic front and back. And while this does still certainly boast a lot of the same sort of weird offbeat atmosphere and little humorous touches that would characterize his work more and more heavily from here on out, in this film, all of that feels just a little bit more scaled back, and you can feel just a bit more of the humanity and the emotion behind the characters than you can in a lot of his other films, with maybe, of course, the exception of Jackie Brown. Guys like Harvey Keitel, Tim Roth, Steve Buscemi, again, Michael Madsen, Chris Penn, certainly Lawrence Tierney, were not exactly what you would call unknown actors prior to this film, but this just makes them all feel so fresh. No matter how many times I've seen this or seen these actors in other films, I come back and watch this, and it's like rediscovering them for the first time. Obviously, they're considerably younger in this film, but there is just something about what I guess just must have been Tarantino's sort of contagious passion for the project that really amps everyone up. Like, everyone has a fire in their belly on this one. You can tell that everybody really thought that they were a part of something very special. And the movie's even structured in such a way that by today's standards, it still does one thing that is still relatively novel, which is doing the exact opposite of the typical heist film approach. You see everything but the crime. Again, Tarantino would become less interested in using implication and suggestion to sort of create, the sensation of violence rather than just depicting it directly and grossly as he did progressively in his films as his budget got more swollen. The way that the characters are constantly talking about the bungled robbery without actually letting us see the majority of it creates an even greater sense of tension the whole time they're in that warehouse. Because while they're holed up in there quiet and worried and disheveled, you still have at least a vague idea that there is still all kinds of hell breaking loose and scattered all over the city. The constant threat of either being killed by one of their own or being arrested is looming over these characters pretty much the entire time. Michael Madsen has never, not once, been better than he was here. He's not as showy or loud as some of the other Tarantino villains like Marcellus Wallace or, Drexel in True Romance, if you want to throw that in there too, I guess. But what he does have, chillingly, is a lot of quiet moments. Like, he's one of those characters like Hannibal Lecter who never raises his voice. Not once. It's that smug, chilling sense of self-confidence that really makes this guy feel like a true psychopath. Because it's one thing if you tell a guy that he can torture you all he wants, and his reaction is sort of like, oh, you want me to do, okay, you want me to torture you? I'll show you a thing or two. It's another thing if the response is just sort of like, torture you. I never thought of that. Let's give it a go. That sounds like a good idea. Yep. Ugh, my God. And I also don't think this movie ever gets quite enough credit for the whole commode story sequence. I mean, I'm sure that everybody knows that sequence from the movie well, but I just love the way you get like a story within a story within a story. And at every level, the dialogue that's given to characters is entertaining and interesting enough that you find yourself getting swept up in that and you've forgotten about the other story that you just got dropped into. In fact, honestly, that whole commode story sequence is so good, you could probably turn it into a short film on its own and it would still stand. Ultimately, I guess I feel about Reservoir Dogs versus Pulp Fiction the same way I feel about Bruce Lee's Fist of Fury versus Enter the Dragon. In both cases, the latter is very clearly the better made movie. Like, just as a movie, there's no question about which one has superior filmmaking craft on display. But, again, for all the artistry in Pulp Fiction, nothing else that Tarantino did in the 90s carries quite the punch and sting of Reservoir Dogs. Anyway, fast forward to 1994, a couple of years later, and in collaboration with writer Roger Avary, Tarantino gave us Pulp Fiction. This is my number 3, and I don't even really have much of anything to say about it just because, again, there's already been so much written and vlogged about this film that at this point, I mean, there isn't really anything that I have to say about it that millions of other people have not said already and probably said better than I could in some cases. This is really the movie that kind of broke the gates open as far as raw, mean, independent filmmaking in the 90s went. But despite the fact that this movie is such a triumph, obviously, it falls a little bit in my ranking just because at this point, I have not gone back to watch this nearly as many times as I have Reservoir Dogs, even though I love this movie. And I think that the main reason for that is, well, besides the fact that, this kind of became almost sort of like the Citizen Kane of independent film, where it's that movie where it's like, okay, are you guys ever going to shut the hell up about this movie? Other movies do exist, Jesus Christ. But it just feels a little less raw, a little less sort of spontaneous and on the fly, and doesn't sort of quite exude that same sort of, fuck everyone attitude that makes Reservoir Dogs feel like such a raw experience every time I watch it. But this movie is still a stone cold cultural landmark, and we are much, much better off for it. Anyways, another 3 years goes by, and in late 1997, we got Jackie Brown. This one's falling a little bit to number 5 again, but make no mistake, I still adore this movie. It's got a special place for me in a way because it's the one time that Tarantino adapted an Elmer Leonard novel, which I kind of wish he would have done more often, but it's obviously not up to me to tell someone else what to do. But Elmer Leonard and Tarantino on a screenwriting level is a beautiful creative marriage. I mean, again, it's not like Leonard actually worked on the screenplay, but you can feel his influence in just the way that the movie's structured in terms of its tone, the characters. I mean, a lot of it is taken right from the novel, but it's very easy to see why someone like Tarantino would be attracted to it. And he's probably one of the few filmmakers who could, fully realize the Leonard tone, except outside of maybe Barry Sonnenfeld. I mean, Get Shorty is still probably my personal high watermark as far as Elmer Leonard adaptations go, that and the TV show Justified. Tarantino is able to take that shared love that he and Elmer Leonard have for scuzzy, low-life, and not particularly bright characters, and use film to expand on those characters in all sorts of ways that a written medium couldn't. And of course, it's also got probably the most genuine emotion and humanity of any of Tarantino's films. And I know that that's kind of a sore spot for some people because there's a lot of people, or at least a decent contingent of people, who consider this his best movie and always kind of lament that he didn't grow more in this particular direction. But of course, when this movie first came out, almost everybody was whining and bitching about how it wasn't Pulp Fiction 2.0. So, I mean, I don't know. But this movie still has so much going for it, not the least of which is the cast. You have Michael Keaton making a big return here and doing a pretty good job. I think he thought he was going to pull a John Travolta when he made this movie. That didn't quite happen. We would have to wait another decade or two for his big comeback. Although, honestly, at this point, I'm not even sure if John Travolta could pull a John Travolta. Samuel L. Jackson plays the character Ordell to absolute perfection. It doesn't just feel like reheated jewels. This feels like a totally new character with his own set of quirks. Don't think Robert De Niro has ever been funnier than he was playing Lewis in this one. My God, like the scene when he just finally has enough of Bridget Fonda's character. Wow, so good. And the romance between Robert Forster's character and Pam Grier is genuinely sweet and compelling. Like, when you finally see those two share a kiss at the end, and I'm not normally one who gets, swept up in romantic plots in movies one way or the other, but when they share a kiss at the end, it actually feels like a climactic moment because these characters are kissing and embracing because of what has happened and how they feel about each other as a result, not just because Tarantino decided that they should. And small bonuses, but it doesn't hurt that we get to see Sid Haig pop up in here, may he rest in peace, as a judge. Oh, and speaking of small casting Easter eggs, keep your eyes peeled for, Michael Bowen is the actor's name. A lot of people today would probably recognize him for playing Uncle Jack in Breaking Bad, but he has a small part in this one as a cop. And to go back to Pam Grier again, I mean, wow. Besides the fact that she still looked amazing in 1997, after spending so much of her career doing all these B movies and all these blaxploitation thrillers, some of which are very good, but finally, after spending her entire career peddling out movies like that, she finally gets her hands on a really prestigious part in an ensemble movie directed by one of the best modern directors. I mean, if anyone ever earned it, it was her. But of course, again, all of this was met with nothing but whining and complaining and sulking from people who apparently just wanted to see Tarantino make movies where everyone's getting their nuts shot off or their ears cut. With that, we arrive at Kill Bill, which I'm folding into one volume despite it having two separate ones. This also marked the longest gap between films for him, as far as I know. This came out in 2003, so about 6 years after Jackie Brown. And it definitely marked a big turning point for him in terms of his style, and specifically his style of violence. Because up until then, in all his films, violence was certainly present, but it was all relatively realistic, or it was done by implication rather than direct depiction, as I think I mentioned once before. But, starting with this one is where we got that really over-the-top, ridiculous, like almost, would-be Looney Tunes if it wasn't so bloody, comic book levels of violence. And he never really stopped using it after that in any of his films. And I don't know if it was because maybe some of the disappointment that people expressed over the relatively reserved tone of Jackie Brown kind of got to him, and he spent some time doing self-reflection or what. I mean, I honestly don't know, but it's hard not to feel like the way that the violence came off in this one was in part a response to people who thought that he was maybe, selling out or going soft. But rather conspicuously, from here on out, there has nary been even like a hint of genuine emotion in any of his films. So who knows what transpired in his mind there, but it sort of feels like Tarantino went through what Jerry did in that one episode of Seinfeld, where he catches himself actually caring when he breaks up with a girl, and or maybe the girl broke up with him, I forget that, but in any case, he's actually deeply affected by it. He doesn't understand what this salty discharge is pouring from his eyes, and yeah, it's sort of hard not to feel like there was a part of him that after that thought, you know what, fuck it, if doing this is just going to get people, whining and complaining like this, I'm just going to stick to putting people through a meat grinder and see how that turns out. Now, all that said, how do I feel about the movie itself? Of course, I love it. I mean, I will never forget the experience of watching this movie in a theater for the first time. In fact, I think that this was actually the first Tarantino movie I got to see in the theater for the first time when it came out. So it kind of holds a little bit of a special place there. This has all the ambition and craft of Pulp Fiction, but with a little more of that caustic, raw attitude and drive that made Reservoir Dogs feel so punchy. This is really Tarantino throwing everything that comes into his imagination on the screen. Like, you can just feel him as a writer sprinting to keep up with his own imagination as this movie unfolds. So why does it fall all the way to number 6 then? I hear some of you may be wondering. Probably just because, for one reason or another, in the years since this movie was released, it's one of the Tarantino films that I have rewatched the least. That may at least partly be because even compared to something like, say, Inglourious Bastards or Django Unchained, this one doesn't have a whole lot of tension per se. I mean, you admire the velocity at which Tarantino is throwing everything on the canvas, but you never really get any real sense of danger or trepidation on the part of the bride, Uma Thurman's character. And Uma Thurman is fantastic in the movie, but there's not really a whole lot of an arc or anything surprising or revealing about her character. She just is out for revenge, and she's right, and she knows she's right, and that's it. So while I love the sheer volume and variety of cinematic candy that's on display in this movie, it is not a movie that after I'm done watching it, if I do ever dust it off and watch it now, doesn't really stick with me, if you know what I mean. I enjoy it while I'm watching it, and then as soon as it's done, I don't really give it another thought. Probably around the time that I originally watched it, it probably would have had a solid number 2 slot for me, but my tastes have changed. I'm a good 20 years older almost than I was when I saw it. Jesus Christ. But that's where I'm at now, so it sits comfortably and quite respectably at number 6. Then we come to 2007 with the release of Death Proof. And this is my number 9. Dead last, but I mean, keep in mind that in this case, that doesn't necessarily mean much in terms of negative implications. As I said before, he's just made a lot of good movies. He hasn't made a single bad movie, and this is just the one that I love the least, but it's still a very good movie. Kurt Russell is absolutely fantastic in this movie. The whole cast is still actually very good, but he's standout excellent. The chase that ends the film is admittedly very well executed. And up until the release of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in 2019, it was kind of the only film of his post-2000 that had any sort of contemporary setting to it. I'm well aware Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was not set in the now necessarily, far from it, but it was at least a relatively contemporary landscape, because at that point I had kind of had my fill of Tarantino's period pieces. That's just a personal thing, but there you go. So just seeing him create characters who are just hanging out and chatting and doing stuff in the present made it feel a little bit fresh. All these actresses are immensely likable, particularly Zoe Bell, and it's kind of nice to see her get a part for herself after all that work she put in as a stunt double on Kill Bill for Uma. And Zoe Bell, I mean, don't get me wrong, she is one of the most innately likable people you will ever see in any movie. I'm still not convinced that she's a screen actress, per se, but Tarantino's always been pretty good about giving her parts that are well within her range. Having her play a fictionalized version of herself in this one was actually a smart move. And, you know, to give credit where it's due, Zoe Bell plays an interesting, engaging version of herself in this movie, which is something that a lot of more serious and accomplished dramatic actors will tell you is a very difficult thing to do. Playing a different version of yourself, I mean, yeah, that's certainly not easy. On the downside, however, first of all, to have a filmmaker as original as Quentin Tarantino just unabashedly wearing his influence on his sleeve is a little bit disheartening. And I mean, I don't know, like, I get that he's into exploitation films. I'm into exploitation films. I don't feel the need to rub that in anyone's face, and neither should he. And although, you know, he might not even have been trying to like rub it in anyone's face per se. Maybe he and Rodriguez were just trying to have fun, and that's cool. Nothing wrong with having fun. But like a couple of Tarantino's lesser movies, at least lesser movies in my opinion, this is probably a film that was a lot more fun to make than it is to actually watch. Because as charming as these ladies are, he lets them talk way, way, way too goddamn much. And I'm sorry to shamelessly steal, but it is just like Roger Ebert said in his review, this movie has 2 speeds, pause and overdrive. And yes, I can certainly appreciate that a lot of the grindhouse movies that he's homaging here were in and of themselves a little bit flawed in terms of their pacing and whatnot, but like I just mentioned in my review of A Cadaver Christmas, you don't get to sort of do this homage and then cop out behind the whole, well, a lot of those movies weren't good, so I didn't bother to make this one good either thing. No, sorry, you're not gonna, no. You are never going to convince me that that's a smart artistic move. I don't care what you say. Still well made. The action choreography and the stunt work is second to none. But I still can't quite escape the feeling that this sort of feels a bit like Tarantino taking a holiday. But then, boys and girls, in 2009, we would be greeted with the masterpiece that is Inglourious Basterds. And in case you couldn't guess by that introduction, this is my number one. Like, with a bullet. And it has been for a while, even before Reservoir Dogs started moving up in my ranks. This was always my favorite Tarantino film, not Pulp Fiction. And this is another one of those ones like Reservoir Dogs where I could start listing off all the various scenes that make me gush in this one. The opening scene with the dairy farmer, anything at all with Christoph Waltz as Hans Landa. Eli Roth as the bear Jew in his big juicy scene. Robert Richardson's perfect cinematography, which has so many rich, dense, painterly colors and qualities to it that just watching this movie, even with the sound turned off, is a pleasurable experience. I mean, this is one of those films where you could freeze frame almost any second of it and you would have a frameable work of art. And the way that he makes use of the multilingual sort of spectrum that World War II occupied in Europe is absolutely brilliant. And really think about it, how many other movies, North American movies, made this much of a splash with a good chunk of the movie being filmed in a foreign language, whether it be German or French or Italian, lest we forget. No matter how many times I watch, I cannot not laugh whenever I see Brad Pitt attempt Italian in this movie. Like, it is just absolutely priceless. I also love the way that Tarantino expertly exploits the audience's bloodlust in this film, because we all have had, I think, stirrings of feelings like, well, gee, if I could get my hands on those Nazis, if I could get my hands on some of those white slavers or whoever else in the world, the scum of the earth, you know what I would do? Let's be honest, most of us would not do sweet shit all, but I digress. The point here is that you think that you want to see this happen, and while it certainly is fun to see these guys get their asses handed to them, the violence goes to that point where it's almost like in a couple instances, particularly the last scene where they're carving the swastika into Landa's forehead, where you find yourself sort of sitting there going, at least initially you're like, okay, hell yeah, kick his ass, Seabass. And then as things progress, it's sort of like, oh, whoa, 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 wait a minute, holy yikes, yikes. And you can feel the movie sort of asking you, well, this is what you wanted, wasn't it? This is the one movie in his filmography more than any other where I feel like you can feel a more complicated and intelligent sense of concern behind all the surface level sensation and violence. And it's just so damn entertaining. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. It might even be, if I had to sit down and think about it, his only like completely perfect movie. Maybe that's just me, but it's the one movie of his at this point where I watch it and there is not a single thing that I would change. So let it be said, for good and all, this is my number one, and I'm still waiting for Tarantino to repeat the success of this one for me personally. Then another 3 years go by, and in 2012 we get Django Unchained. This one falls to number 7, and it's worth noting that this was the first film that he made without his longtime editor, Sally Menke. She, I believe, between Inglourious Basterds and this, was tragically killed in a hiking accident or something like that. If you were marathoning Tarantino's films, I think by the time you got to this one, the difference in the editing would kind of stick out like a sore thumb, because it really does whenever I watch it now. Now, granted, this was also Fred Raskin's first go-around with Tarantino, and I think that by the time they got to The Hateful Eight, they had gotten a little more used to each other. But there's no escaping that this movie does not feel quite as tight as all his previous films do in terms of their editing and construction. A lot of the time in this movie, it feels a little bit more sort of meandering and sort of lackadaisical, like we're not sure where it's going, and even he's not sure where it's going. There's just a certain lack of discipline, for lack of a better word here, and that's not really the kind of feeling that I would want or expect from a Tarantino film. Christoph Waltz is fantastic again, and Jamie Foxx is very good. The cast across the board, again, does not embarrass themselves in the least. In fact, this is one of my favorite DiCaprio performances. Calvin Candy is a fully formed villain, and I love every second of that character's screen time. And I like Kerry Washington as well, for that matter. It's hard for me not to kind of like smirk a little bit every time she plugs her ears at the very end as Candyland is about to explode. Very cute stuff. And everything involving the Stephen character, from Samuel L. Jackson's performance to the insightful way that Tarantino creates this character, is downright brilliant. And it touches on something that a lot of people even now are sometimes hesitant to admit or examine, which is the fact that white slavers were enabled, in part at least, by African Americans who threw their own race under the bus just because they were scared and wanted to survive. I mean, can you blame them, really? I mean, I'm not saying that, morally it's an admirable choice, but Christ, man, if it was that or getting lynched, I mean, what would most of us do if we only had a split second to make a choice? I think I know. And it's just deliciously disgusting the way that they show you how this character has been so corrupted by the sick influence of racism in his life that he is married to the idea, nursing a severe delusion that he's a white slaver himself. This was also the first time that Walton Goggins was cast in a Tarantino film. It wasn't his big splash in terms of becoming part of the family. I think that we would get that one movie later. But being a huge fan of him from The Shield and Justified at that point, it still definitely made me light up to see him in a movie, and in a Tarantino movie, no less. In terms of its aesthetics, this is right on par with Inglourious Basterds. It's just that Tarantino, in my opinion, does not have as strong a grip and as much of a driving sense of control over the material as he did in Inglourious Basterds. And again, A large part of that, I think, can be attributed to the absence of Sally Menke on this movie. And all his movies since then, which have, I think, been progressively, in their own ways, more and more indulgent. Sally Menke really was his secret weapon. Like, she knew how to say no to him. I'm not so sure that Fred Raskin has figured that out yet. Even the big shootout at Candyland is a good example of that, because it's fun and long and bloody, but it feels like it's long and bloody just kind of for the sake of being long and bloody. And it's kind of weird because that almost feels like it should be the climax, but then the movie kind of gets drawn out for about another 20 or 30 minutes and they circle back there again. And something about that just, yeah, I don't know. I know that he won the Oscar for the screenplay for this one, but in my opinion, he should have gotten that for Inglourious Basterds. What can I say? All that said, my appreciation for this movie has grown over time. Like most of Tarantino's films, the more I go back and watch it, the more I find little things to like. So another 3 years go by, and in 2015, we got The Hateful Eight. Robert Richardson came back again to do the cinematography for this one, of course, and in this case, it was actually filmed famously on 70mm film, which is a bit wider than even what we think of as the usual wide ratio aspect. Ennio Morricone came on board to compose the score. It was the first time he'd scored a Western in decades. The roadshow format that they were announcing for this, with a little pamphlet beforehand, an intermission in the middle, all the old school bells and whistles, because of course, in case you hadn't noticed, Tarantino is about as nostalgic as film fans get. When I saw the initial previews and saw who was in the movie and started hearing more about the concept, I could not have been more excited. Like, I really thought this was going to be the one to sit next to Inglourious Basterds when it came out. And I remember, I think I saw this one like 3 or 4 times within the first couple of weeks that it was released when it came out in theaters. And I remember at the time, like, sort of convincing myself, like, this is amazing. This is a masterpiece. This is absolutely perfect. And it's not really... This is going to seem very cutesy under the circumstances, but this is my number 8. Hateful Eight is still a very good movie, and it's one of those movies that I like to put on almost every winter season at least once, just because, with the whole wintry atmosphere and all the scenes set inside the wood cabin, it's a great movie to put on if you just want to relax with a cup of hot coffee or hot chocolate or a mocha or a nice tall glass of highball bourbon or something like that, and just sit back and luxuriate in the very sumptuous atmosphere that this movie creates. And I am positive this is his best looking movie. Everything from the costume design to the cinematography to the production design, it's all absolutely top drawer, even by Tarantino standards. And the movie starts out feeling like it is going to be a masterpiece. But then as the movie wears on, it feels like it's almost a bit hesitant to get to its own payoff. And again, it's so funny the way that these things come in waves, because I feel like I'm repeating one of the main criticisms that I had when I reviewed Sometimes They Come Back for More. But I think the same thing applies here, which is that part of the reason that this movie is somewhat hesitant to kind of, get on with it and get to the climax and the meat of the story is because there really isn't a lot here when it's all said and done. I mean, again, for all the elaborate sets and costumes and stunning cinematography and just the whole sort of tone and pretense that this movie carries, like you're watching a masterpiece, it's a very simple story that is quite needlessly drawn out. Like, I feel like if this movie had had more of sort of like a runtime in the vicinity of something like, say, Reservoir Dogs or Death Proof, it would have functioned much better. Like, if it had just been content to be a B-movie Western romp, like a mystery Western thriller, it would have been much better off. But because, Tarantino seems to feel this need or this compulsion to pump everything up and make it a quote-unquote masterpiece, you end up with this movie that is so overwritten, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, you spent almost a half hour on that goddamn stagecoach in the beginning, And that's not to say that it's boring conversation, especially once they pick up Walton Goggins. That's when the movie really starts to come to life for me. I mean, again, in case you couldn't tell, I am a huge mark out for Walton Goggins. I think he's one of the best actors of his generation. Consistently entertaining, raw, powerful, pretty much incapable of a bad performance. And everything about this guy, from his hair to his teeth to his exaggerated facial expressions, this guy is a born performer. And he's also, like if you were to like give me my choices of an actor that I could actually sit down and have a conversation with, he would probably be at the top of the list. I mean, every interview I see with him, he feels like he's one of these people who actually has a healthy respect for literature and art, and just really, no matter what you put him in, he is always going to give 150% at a minimum. For all the entertainment value of his banter with the other guys on that stagecoach, did we really need to spend that long on the stagecoach? No, I don't think we did. I also don't think we needed that extended flashback showing us how the whole gang got there and took over Minnie's haberdashery. Because other than the fact that you get to actually see these guys tear the place apart, it doesn't really add anything in terms of the story or insight into the characters or anything like that. It's not anything that really isn't explained with just a couple of lines of dialogue once you get back to the present. The way the movie was built up and promoted prior to its release as being this big, huge whodunit, where you got a ragtag group of guys who can't be trusted, and as Tarantino, I think, said himself, he's going to put them all in this cabin in the middle of nowhere and let them hash it out. I like that idea. That's not really what we got, though, especially not with that whole revelation that half of these guys are all just part of the same bandit gang. Like, that just wasn't that interesting to me. And like someone else who saw the movie mentioned to me once, when it's being sort of built up as a bit of a mystery thriller or a whodunit, if you will, and then you find out that the answer to whodunit is they all done it. Again, I don't know. That's just not a particularly compelling revelation to me. And then all the stuff revolving Samuel L. Jackson's character carrying that fake Lincoln letter is not nearly as scathing or insightful as Tarantino seems to think it is. And even though Walton Goggins, Samuel L. Jackson, and Jennifer Jason Leigh are all acting the unholy hell out of that final scene and giving it everything they've got, that whole thing to me just feels really messy and like a bunch of hamsters circling. All that stuff with the back and forth between Goggins and Leigh, the way that she's trying to convince him to maybe kill Samuel L. Jackson's character, and for a minute it looks like he might, but then he might not, but then he might again, but then they just say, screw that, we're gonna hang you anyways. It just feels like the screenplay is writing these three into a corner that they're struggling to bust out of. And, that's frankly not the kind of thing that I expect from Tarantino, but it's also not the sort of thing that I could abide with any screenplay, least of all one from one of the best writers of his generation. And because it does often feel like a bit of a film stage play, and a lot of the dialogue has a very, shall we say, writerly quality to it, I can sort of understand why some people call this his best screenplay. But I will respectfully disagree with you there. The movie's never boring, it's always a joy to behold visually, but it never really quite delivers on the kind of wallop of an ending that you would expect a movie like this to have. Much like Death Proof, I feel like this one was probably a lot more fun to make than it is to actually watch. And in retrospect, I accept and acknowledge that part of that might have been that I made it the victim of my own high expectations, but those expectations were there for a reason. Then 4 years later, 2019, minus the Weinsteins this time, and good riddance, we get Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And this is my number 4. I love this movie. I really love this movie. Not the least because it is probably at this point my favorite DiCaprio performance, and he's obviously had a lot of them, but I can't remember the last time he did something that made me laugh this hard and this long and just kept me fascinated every second he was on screen. Rick Dalton is an amazing comic creation. Anyone who has ever attempted acting at any point in their life will find themselves identifying with his character in this movie, more so than they probably want to admit. But he zeroes in on that actor insecurity and just sort of general fragile sense of emotion perfectly. Speaking of actors, this also marks Luke Perry's last screen appearance. May he rest in peace. By the way, seeing him playing a dad in Riverdale, man, if that doesn't make me feel ancient, I don't know what will. And it's easy to sort of say that people like this movie just because anyone who's a film fan or a film critic or a filmmaker is, of course, going to love any movie that is a love letter to the golden age of Hollywood. But I think this movie does a very good job of showcasing the glamour and mystique that made Hollywood so attractive back then, while it also subverts the classical Hollywood depiction of heroes on screen. Brad Pitt as Cliff Booth, couldn't be a better foil to DiCaprio, and their sense of friendship and camaraderie feels very unforced, very sincere, even, dare I say it, endearing. And so often in movies, I feel like fictional stuntmen are kind of done wrong because they're always depicted as being these sort of meat-headed bro douches. But Cliff Booth is, by all accounts, what most real stuntmen are really like. Confident, cool, but laid back and without any real penchant for the limelight at all. Like, this is a guy who has had a good, healthy, sustained career as a stuntman, and he's happy with that. Whether his personal life is as stable and peaceful and happy, well, that's another story, and that's largely left up to your interpretation. Just out of curiosity, what do you guys think? Do you think he actually murdered his wife? I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, I go back and forth on that, but then I'm not really sure that knowing that for sure is really the point. It's just more that, like a lot of Hollywood stars who are reticent, you never really know what could be going on behind the surface. I mean, how many times have we had revelations over the past couple of decades about a celebrity's proclivities where you find yourself going, what? That guy was doing that? Seriously? But he always seems so calm. But Tarantino does it one better than just giving you a straight answer one way or the other by showing you how violent Cliff can be in the closing scenes. And that's even a bit better because you don't know if he did actually kill his wife, but based on what you see, he certainly could. He certainly would be capable of doing it. But did he? And, that raises the question. If someone is capable of doing something, can we hold that against them even if they didn't actually do it? Just in general, there's a sweetness and a warmth that pervades this movie that you don't really find in any other Tarantino movie. Not even Jackie Brown. I mean, Jackie Brown, again, probably has the most sincere emotion, but this has, probably the most sincere, deep, and intoxicating sense of love and affection for the movie business. And it's movies like this and Jackie Brown where you really sort of feel a bit more of that Robert Altman influence coming through in Tarantino. I mean, I seem to remember reading or hearing an interview somewhere that Tarantino mentioned that Robert Altman is a pretty important influence on him. Granted, Altman is an influence on a lot of filmmakers, but the way that he handles ensemble casts, particularly if you look at Jackie Brown, and to a lesser extent this one, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the way that he juggles these big sprawling ensemble casts, that is pure Altman. Near the very end, when Cliff Booth is being taken away in that ambulance and he and Rick share that final little wave in exchange, and it's just a simple thing, by Tarantino standards, it's not the most loquacious exchange in the world. It's just Rick waving and telling Cliff he's a good friend. Cliff waves back in his acid-induced stupor and says, I try. Just so sincere and kind of has this just enchanting goofiness to it that makes it probably, one of my favorite expressions of friendship in almost any movie I've ever seen. This movie just has such an infectious sense of warmth. It just makes me smile so long and so wide that I would be absolutely remiss to not include this in my top 5. And it also provides a damn good answer to some of the people who were maybe speculating that Tarantino had run out of gas after The Hateful Eight. I have a feeling this could be one of those films that might go up in my ranking in the future as the years go on, but for now it can sit comfortably and proudly at number 4. And that wraps it up. I mean, we've all heard more than once by now that Tarantino is planning to only make around 10 movies. And the way things are going, I feel like that might actually be the case. Tarantino seems to be devoting more and more of his time now to essays and novels that revolve around film rather than filmmaking itself. And being as he's married and he's a dad now, that kind of makes sense. I mean, I think that probably, if you're a responsible parent, you're going to have to scale this back. And I also kind of have to respect that he would just, sort of try to have a well-rounded filmography that doesn't have any real stains on it, rather than keep going and going and going. I mean, as much as I have to respect Clint Eastwood for still making movies into his 90s, I will also admit that he probably should have called it quits at least a decade earlier. And I would hate to see a filmmaker and a writer like Tarantino turn into one of those people where me and other people as old fogies are sitting around trying to explain to kids that no, you should have seen this guy back when he was still really good. I don't want to see that happen to Tarantino, and I doubt it will. I think he's savvy enough to know when he doesn't have any gas left in the tank. But whenever we get his final film, whatever it looks like, you can almost bet that it will not be ending his career on a down note. He will go out on a high note. I have no doubt of that at all. Too bad. I would be curious to see what a guy like him could do with other people's work. I'd be curious to see what would happen if he collaborated with a screenwriter like, say, Taylor Sheridan. I mean, oh, Jesus Christ, that just about makes my head explode thinking of the possibilities there. For that matter, I wouldn't mind seeing him give some of his screenplays, if he still has any of those left on the shelf, to other filmmakers to work with. I mean, one of the things that makes True Romance stand out is that it's a Tarantino script front and back, but it's filtered through the vision of director Tony Scott. I personally think directors like Damien Chazelle or maybe even Jeremy Saulnier, as an example, could both do fantastic things with a Tarantino script. But at this point, I think it's pretty safe to assume that Tarantino is sort of set in his ways. He's been able to do it all his own way from the start of his career, essentially, all the way through. I don't see him deviating from that rut anytime soon. And I mean, when you're making movies this good, there's really no reason to. So much for that. Would be cool, but it's probably not going to happen. Anyway, that's about all I have for this one for now. I will probably dabble in this again. It's fun, and it's also just kind of a chance to let people sort of see some of the things that I appreciate outside the horror genre. So you can count on more of these somewhere down the line. Pondering a director's filmography as a whole is sometimes a good way for me to either get reacquainted with them or maybe even just develop a keener, more sort of refined sense of why I've had a sustained love and support for these filmmakers for so many years now. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Leave your own opinions on Tarantino's filmography down in the comments if you want. And look for more Christmas horror content coming your way really soon. Have a great evening.